Good afternoon. We are going to start in a couple of minutes. We're just going to give an opportunity for others to possibly join, but we plan to begin the webinar at 2:05. If you're already on the call, thank you for joining, and we will begin shortly.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending our webinar, which will be focusing on why waiting for certifications is bad for business. Our presenter today will be Brent Green, a Business Development Manager for our consulting practice here at ITG. Previously, Brent was a Senior Process Improvement Consultant within the consulting practice team. He has spent over 10 years working in quality management as a quality coordinator and analyst, certified lead internal auditor, and has worked with companies within both the federal and commercial sectors. As a junior and senior consultant, Brent has assisted companies in developing and implementing best practices related to ISO 9001, 20000, 27001, and CMMI for Service Maturity Level 3 requirements. Just a few things before we get started. We've muted everyone's mics to reduce background noise. And if you have any questions, please utilize the chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen. We will hold all questions until the end and do our best to answer as many as we can. If we're unable to answer them during our time today, don't worry. We will follow up with an email answering any lingering questions. We would like to thank you all again for your attending, and I'd like to now hand it over to our presenter, Brent Green.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that wonderful introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you again for taking time out of your schedule to attend our webinar for why waiting for certifications can be bad for business. Again, my name is Brent Green. I am currently the Business Development Manager for our consulting practice group here at ITG. The focus on why we wanted to provide a webinar on waiting for certifications is bad is our way of communicating best practices and lessons learned that we have experienced with working with our various clients when implementing best practices within their organization. As the Business Development Manager, I've had many conversations with organization leaders and staff assigned to determine how to implement best practices and what the level of effort would be to implement best practices, and what it would take for them to successfully implement the practices and obtain certification for common best practices within our industry. Some of the main topics that we will discuss today will be part of our agenda that is outlined on the slide. These topics are, what are some of the business drivers? We'll talk a little bit about return on investment for implementing and certifying to best practices. What are potential schedule and timelines that it would take an organization to implement these practices? What are also some of the potential business impacts, considerations that an organization should take when looking at which best practices to certify to and implement within their organization? Lessons learned, that we've gathered information from some of our clients and, that we have noticed as consultants with being able to implement and help organizations successfully certify. And as Sarah pointed out, we will allow time for questions. I hope that the intent of this webinar is that I hope I cover some of the key topic areas. I know that I might not touch on every single point of interest that you may have, but definitely, ask those questions later on, and I will definitely provide the best answer I have to make sure that you feel like you've gotten the most out of this webinar and presentation. To give you a little bit overview of ITG, who are we? ITG is a government contractor. We provide consulting services in various areas and services with federal agencies. In particular, I want to highlight that our consulting practice has been in place for over 10 years, and we have helped organizations to implement best practices we have internally certified to and appraised to within our own organization. So ITG does currently hold the certifications and appraisals to the best practices you see in the box on the bottom left. We do have a active quality management system, IT service management system, information security management system. We do have appraisal to CMMI to development at maturity level 3. And we also have appraisal to CMMI for services to maturity level 3. And that's one thing I believe that makes us unique in terms of being a successful consulting practice, is that we not only help and guide organizations with implementing and preparing for certification and appraisal, but we also maintain these certifications and best practices within our own organization. I may go off script from what's on the presentation, just because I want to provide some personal insight of my experiences with helping organizations that I work for or help to consult on with determining what's the best strategy or why we should plan for implementation and certification of best practices. There can be various reasons why an organization would want to be certified to some of these common best practices, and there could be multiple business drivers on why we want to do this. Some of those examples could be establishing a standardization within your organization to help assist with company growth, anticipated growth, and most companies that we work with that are small and medium-sized businesses, they do want to grow, and it's part of their business strategy. So having flexibility of being a small business, but still having some standardized practices for how to perform certain activities will help them to will grow as time moves on, because many of us know that have worked in small, medium-sized businesses, which I have, it could take 1 or 2 contracts, and next thing you know, you're no longer a small business. And, preparing and having some of these standard and common best practices within your organization would help you with maturing and handling that growth. Other organizations, especially medium to large organizations who've already gotten past that hurdle, may look at ways to always look to continually improve and not fall behind the curve. It's very good to be able to grow your business, but as you get to a certain size, you want to do your best not to be static or stagnant. You always want to try to be able to still compete, even as a large business, and stay either ahead of the curve with other businesses that you may be competing against, or have the ability to work with and not fall behind. Other business drivers that organizations can take into consideration is to allow their ability to promote themselves, to communicate to customers of the type of growth that they have within the organization by having these certifications, and also the ability to compete in certain markets and industries that they already in, they may already be in, or looking to get their foot in the door. As I said before, having some of these certifications and being able to promote and state that we have these type of certifications within an organization helps you to, communicate and promote and demonstrate and support your business's specific strategic goals, and always have a plan in place to align and help to successfully achieve those goals by not waiting to the last minute to have certifications in place. There are a lot of there are different types of certifications that businesses may need to keep track of in order to support their current and future business needs. This slide here has an example of, the three most common certifications that organizations may need to consider or track and monitor. Of course, there's personal certifications that, some of our staff may have to have in order to provide services or products and solutions to customers. There also could be some compliance requirements, and we have to have compliance certifications in place in order to adhere and make sure that we don't fall out of adherence and potentially, have a fine or have a discussion with our customers of why we can't adhere to any compliance certifications we're required to have. What we're going to focus on today is mostly the column in purple, which is the organizational certifications. And in that column, you can see that we have examples of the various and most common ones that are within our industry, specifically with ISO and CMMI there. Many of the organizational best practices will guide a company to have formalized approach for identifying, tracking, and monitoring the certifications that you have in place. And what I mean by that is that these best practices, ISO and CMMI, help guide an organization to think, what are some of the key expectation requirements that you need within your business or that your company may need, and how are you monitoring and tracking those? So this is a good example of what the type of certifications you may need within your organization in order to compete within the industry itself. This is another slide that, again, gives you another overview and a different look of the type of best practices that companies within our industry look to obtain certification to. They are three of the most common ones definitely are within the federal government agencies for government contractors, are definitely security. That's a very hot topic now, and some of those requirements look at ISO 27001 and NIST practices. There is alignment between the 27001 and NIST, not fully aligned, but there is alignment with those two best practices and requirements. Services, which many of the organizations within government contractors within the industry are providing services and solutions. So you're looking at, some common best practices for ISO 20000, CMMI for services, which both of those standards use IDLE as their baseline. And of course, in the presentation it says software development, but it could be any kind of development that an organization is looking to provide to customers, whether it's product development or software development. The key point here is, by looking at the slide, is when you're trying to plan for what best practices you would need to certify to, you would want to look at what are your core capabilities of what you're looking to provide and promote to customers. And that will help guide you to establishing what the business strategy for what best practices would best fit your organization and provide a return on value and investment in the long term for getting certification and maintaining certification, and then being able to promote that you have these certifications in place within your company to your customers. Again, for most that are on this call that are government contractors, the next couple of slides, I believe, will really hit home for you, because we will focus on some of the requirements and expectations that some of the federal government agencies anticipate or expect us to have within our organization in order to either be able to have the opportunity to bid on certain awards and contracts and work, or things that they want to see within our organization to kind of demonstrate, our company's growth and maturity by having certification to these best practices. For this particular slide here, the example we provided here is that this solicitation from a government agency is asking specifically for ISO 20000 certification. which is, of course, in line with being organization being able to demonstrate that they have best practices in place to properly manage and provide help desk support for what the requirements are that a customer's needs. So having a good understanding of customer expectation requirements based upon the type of work that you will be either soliciting to the government that you can perform, or what you know the type of work they're going to be looking for, can increase your opportunity to compete with your competitors and potentially win more business. This next slide provides a sample of key government contracts over the past decade that have looked for or required that organizations will have certain certifications in place to be considered for contract award and the ability to provide the support the federal agencies need. As you can see within this graph, there are a lot of key contracts that the government has provided solicitation for, where they ask if organizations have some of these key practices in place and are certified to them. An example would be in the bottom left bullet was that, 60 out of this sample here, 68% of these contracts were asking organizations and companies, do you have ISO 9001 certification? About 40% were focused on IT service management or service management with ISO 20000. And I believe this is going to continue to grow. And this sample is not of current data, but 21% at this time were looking for an organization to have ISO 27001 certification for information security management to see if they have best practices, policies, and controls in place for securing and protecting data. CMMI, which is the framework that has multiple models to it, is also looked at from the customer for federal agencies for organizations to have in place. And there are various models, with two of the most common ones being CMMI for services and CMMI for development, depending on the type of work that's being provided or requested. And again, if you look, that's a very high number. About 65% of these contracts or solicitations also ask for CMMI as well. So again, the key point here is planning to have certifications in place prior to the solicitations coming to you or hitting your doorstep, or sometimes in the case where you have to hunt and find them, can help improve your organization's ability to win the work that the government agencies are looking for within our industry. This is an interesting slide that I like a lot, because in the previous two slides, we looked at areas where the government is requiring that organizations have some of these certifications of best practices. But this example is a little different. This example doesn't necessarily 100% require it, but it does ask in certain areas and for certain tasks, do you have these certifications in place? So even though the solicitation or the government agency is not stating that you have to have these best practices in place, I always say it can't hurt you to have them in place ahead of time. And it could give you a competitive edge over some of the other companies who are looking to bid on the same type of work, but you have a differentiator because you planned ahead, you've gotten certification to some of these best practices, and again, from a snapshot with the government customer looking at all these different companies who are looking to bid and work, they will see that, company A can do the work, has communicated in their proposal that they can perform the work, but may not have any certifications to back that, someone else has come in and verified that they're able to do or have these best practices in place in order to perform the work at the level the customer needs. You, as company B, on the other hand, have taken a road of thinking ahead and getting some of these certifications in place that fit your business strategy again, and you actually can provide and state that you can do the same or better and that you also have certifications to prove that your other competitors may not have. And that could be the leg up you need in order to be able to win more work. So again, not waiting until the last minute, planning ahead of time, having a strategy in place can help you with getting some additional work you might not have planned of before. And that can always be a good thing. I haven't met a manager or an executive management team that said that was a bad thing. A little different example for this slide. This particular slide looks at various certifications that a company can have. Now, for some businesses, one certification may be enough, but having multiple certifications to best practices may also help in other ways. This particular slide, if you look in the example on the bottom, uses a point structure. And an organization that has certification to these different best practices allows them to get a higher percentage of points. Sometimes the government agencies will use this point structure to kind of determine via snapshot, the maturity and growth of an organization and their ability to maintain, to have and maintain best practices within their organization. Now, having multiple, certifications doesn't always, equal that you will be awarded, but it can help you by making sure you stay in contention with some of your other competitors, or you could be the differentiator from other competitors bidding on that particular piece of work. Here, we're going to talk about the basics. And these are the basics of best practices that organizations can have implemented, whether or not they have certification or not. But this slide is a great demonstration of giving you an example of two very known frameworks in the government industry, in the government contracting world as well, ISO and CMMI. Now, certain agencies may ask for ISO, certain agencies may ask for CMMI, some may ask for both, as you can see from the previous slides. But there are core practices that even both of these models would like to have, or would like organizations to have established and implemented within their organization. And some of these include having a good management review program in place, where management and the team of folks performing work are looking at the key information and data to make sure that you are adhering to requirements, that you're looking for ways to improve, that you're identifying key risks ahead of time instead of having them realized, and maybe putting some action plans in place to mitigate risks from occurring. A good documentation management practice to have in place. And as you see to the right of it, you can see how many of these frameworks have documentation management requirements. And documentation management doesn't just mean how you're controlling documents, things like policies and processes, work instructions and templates. It touches on how you manage storage, how you manage access, distribution, and ensuring that key and core records, whether they're yours or clients or both, are being maintained within your organization. So that is a very, very key practice. And I could say, as a lead auditor and a consultant, this is one of the practices where some companies struggle with. So as you have a good documentation management practice in place, it can help mitigate a lot of potential risks and issues. It also can help with ensuring that up-to-date and key information is communicated and available to those who need it within your company. Of course, all companies need policies. We need good core policies in place that help us with ensuring that requirements are being met, ensuring that we have firmly identified roles and responsibilities and key resources to ensure that we're not only to meet our internal needs for our work, our corporate offices and our work environment internally, but we also have defined roles and responsibilities, clearly defined roles and responsibilities and resources available to support customer deliverables expectations. So, and again, that goes a little bit into capacity management, where we make sure we have all the capacity needs we have to fulfill and support our not only our internal needs, but our customers. Metrics. Are we looking at the right metrics, and are we monitoring them and taking proactive and or corrective action based upon the outputs of those metrics? Customer feedback. And I always like to say that this customer feedback really should be customer perception. How is it that our customers are looking at us? Can we kind of tell ahead of time instead of waiting to the end to determine if we're providing satisfactory work, or if our customers are not as satisfied? And then always, how are we monitoring, measuring our efforts? And then information security. Information security practices is become a forefront in today's world, and every organization, whether small or large, to me, should have a good set of information security policies, processes, controls in place to not only protect your data, but even if you have a requirement to protect your customers' data. So again, these are basic practices that that are asked for out of ISO and CMMI models alike. And some of the times it takes time to get these in place. These things cannot always be implemented and completed in a snap of a finger. It may take time based upon your organization's resource capabilities. So planning ahead of time and having good practices in place is another reason why you want to plan ahead and not wait till the last minute to implement these best practices and then achieve certification. Because even after certification, you want to make sure these best practices are working within your organization. So we'll also talk a little bit about path to certification. There are various paths that you can take. And again, I kind of tie this back to looking at your business strategy for how you want to certify or obtain certification to these best practices, whether it's one or multiple. So, of course, identifying your core needs will help drive your strategy for achievement of certification and identify your path to certification and increase the potential of success for achieving your certification within your timeline. So a couple of things that you want to consider in the slide, it gives you examples, are, doing market research. If you're not sure of what, certifications best fit your market or the capabilities that you're providing to customers, do some market research to see what others are doing and what others are achieving within your organization. Maybe you're working with a teaming partner, or maybe a subcontractor or a prime. You can discuss with your peers, or even those you're supporting, prime contractors if you're a sub, to kind of get an idea of what type of certifications you would need to better position yourself to win more subcontracts, or even as you grow, become a prime yourself and maybe have your prime be a teaming partner, because I've seen many of those relationships change over time. Definitely evaluate your own needs. Knowing your own needs as an organization definitely helps with identifying your path to certification. Again, I touched on resources. Resources as a budget, financial resources can always have an impact on whether or not this is the right time for you to achieve certification for one or many. And also what your anticipated timeline is. All those things can take into consideration what your path to certification could be. And always also what compliance requirements are required by you as an organization in order for you to be able to either win opportunities or maintain contracts that you currently have with your current customers. Many of those paths can help you determine the correct path for certification. I get this question all the time. This is a fun question to answer. How long is it going to take? What's the schedule? And what's the timeline? This will vary again if you've done your homework and you've done your work in putting together a business strategy ahead of time. You would kind of have an idea of what the timeline expectations are needed. in order for you to achieve certification and still support your strategic goals for either growth or for whatever goals you have in place for your organization. Some of these factors, when it comes to schedule and timeline, and piggybacking off of what I've just stated in the last slide, are some of the requirements that you need for implementation to these models and frameworks. A lot of these, and I'll restate that, some of these frameworks and best practices have many requirements or few requirements. Some don't have as many as others. So, of course, if you don't have to adhere to as many requirements, the timeline could be shorter for you to achieve certification. However, there are some of those best practices and certifications that have many requirements. And of course, like anything else, the more requirements there are, the more work may need to be done in order to implement and adhere to those requirements. And that may take more time if you don't have dedicated resources, which does happen a lot of times when I'm working with smaller and medium-sized clients. They don't have always dedicated resources, and we're working with those within the organization who also have daily activities that they need to perform, as well as assist with implementation and preparing for certification to these best practices. Maturity of an organization. Some organizations that we do visit and we talk to already have very mature practices in place, and it may not take as long to be able to implement and certify to an ISO or a CMMI or any other best practice that you're looking at. Some organizations don't have much at all, so that also is also a consideration when we're talking about schedule and timeline for implementation and certification, and why waiting too late to do so could have a negative impact on your ability to achieve certification. And I've actually had this happen this week, where I had a potential client ask us if we could support them with achieving certification within a very aggressive timeline. And I unfortunately had to tell them that the chances of them achieving certification, because they don't have much maturity in their organization, based upon their explanation to me, was very unlikely. And that did have a negative impact on their business goals for winning an award on a contract, or potentially being able to bid on a contract. So again, we want to try to plan ahead of time for what certifications we feel we're going to need. Again, the level of capacity of internal resources, because implementing these best practices, this is not a personal certification. These organizational certifications usually take a group of people or one or more people within an organization, depending on your size, to help implement practices and show evidence that these practices are fully implemented within your organization, so you can achieve certification. Certifications are not just about documentation and whether or not you have something documented. A lot of times, and actually 100% of the time, I shouldn't say a lot of times, 100% of the time, you will be asked to see what documentation you have in place, and also how you executed to the requirements or the approach of you've outlined for having these best practices in place. So internal resources and their capacity can also have an impact on the timeline and schedule. Again, budget. That's another key area. Some certifications don't cost as much as others to obtain. So looking at the potential budget could have an impact on your schedule and timeline for when you can achieve or afford to have someone to achieve and obtain certification. Level of stress and anxiety of staff. This is a hot one. We have done and helped organizations achieve certification in shorter timelines than we would have liked. The downside to that is the experience with implementing these best practices in preparation for certification was not fun for staff. I will not lie and tell you, we've had people that have quit in the middle of implementation or lost motivation in the middle of implementation, which has caused risks for helping us to guide the organization to achieve their certification. So if you don't have dedicated resources, if you're not a very large company, and you're a small to medium-sized company, please take into consideration the anxiety and stress levels of the staff that will be asked to participate with implementing these practices, and what that does to them in the daily workday, and will they enjoy the experience? Possibly not, but will it be a positive influencing experience for them? Because even after certification is over, your organization will be expected to maintain these best practices and keep operating to what you have implemented. And again, I'll focus on bullet number 4. An overly aggressive timeline can lead to just a check of the box documentation. When you do a check of the box approach, you normally don't get the return on investment and value externally, internally that you anticipated. You may not see the maturity and growth internally that you wanted to see, streamlined processes, effective processes, reduction in waste for getting certain activities done. Those things will still linger if you just take the check the box approach. And then a lot of times what I've seen happen in experience too is that when the organization does the check the box approach, they're normally not able to maintain it successfully. So the next time around, when they're getting audited or looked at to see if they're maintaining their certification, you may not be successful the next time around. So having a realistic schedule in place by planning will help you to alleviate some of those risks. This slide talks about the implementation stages that we have had success as a consulting practice with helping our customers achieve certification. First thing we always discuss is scoping. Where do we want to apply these best practices within the organization? Do we implement in enterprise-wide, or do we focus on certain areas where it's most needed and makes the best sense to implement and help organizations to implement good best practices and successfully certify? Perform a gap analysis. Like I stated, these certifications, these best practices have requirements that you want to meet. And a good way to know, again, that could tie into scheduling, timeline, and effort, is to see where your current best practices are to the requirements of what you're looking to get certified to. So performing a gap analysis will help you to determine the timeline and level of support needed to prepare for certification. Identifying resources, or definition in this case. Who's going to be available to help participate and support implementation? Who is the main point of contact? Usually there's a sponsor and even a coordinator internally that we work with that helps guide the process and helps us to work with organizations to implement these best practices. Develop an implementation plan, and definitely finalize a plan and communicate it to those who are actively participating in implementation, so everyone understands their roles, their roles and responsibilities, and the level of effort that they need. The next is always development of the system. This is where we look at, creating documentation that is needed. This is where we may look at establishing resources that may be needed in order to support some of the activities for implementing these best practices. Providing informal training to staff members or those who are part of the process of implementation so they understand what it is they're doing and why they're doing it. After we do that, you definitely in our implementation or execution operation phase. Once you identified and set up all these, define these processes, set up the resources, now we need to execute and implement and use these processes, because we'll need to collect the evidence to show that these processes, these practices that we have in place are being utilized within the organization. And of course, prepare. Prepare for certification includes us doing an internal audit. Let's do our own internal gut check first before we have somebody else come and assess whether or not we're doing a good job. Make the corrections and adjustments that we need, and ensure that those who we have asked to be part of the implementation certification process are well prepared so we can be successful. And the last phase is we just go through the validation phase, where we have an external third-party organization come and assess how well we implemented these best practices and hopefully achieve certification or appraisal. These are additional considerations that an organization can take in mind when you're looking at, planning out the strategic path for achieving certification. Some of the things I've seen, especially in the government contracting industry, is that quality best practices or best practices to certain areas, as we had in the a slide above where it talked about certain practices specific for development, certain practices for security and services. That demand constantly seems to increase with solicitations coming from the government. And I've even seen it starting to creep up, especially information security in the commercial world, where, subcontractors or even companies are asked to protect information and data. Understanding, the expectations of again, I talked about this before, understanding the expectations of your clients, whether they're federal or commercial, keeping a beat on what was going on in your industry, in your market, and what some of the increased expectations are. You can gather the information, by looking at if there's data out there that you can assess and analyze, or like I said, I've gotten a lot of information by going to meeting groups and finding out what's going on in different areas with different companies for, these meetings that are out there, social meetings and business meetings that are out there. So I've gotten information from there. Look at phasing in the requirements that you need in order to achieve certification. Again, talking about that strategic plan. And there's also pressure to have standardization in place especially from federal contractors. As I said before, you start seeing a lot more requirements to have certification, the best practices, as the government's way of verifying that an organization has a certain type of maturity and growth already established within the company. So there's always that downstream pressure for making sure that there's a focus on some type of form of standardization, and these best practices can help you know how to do that without you guessing. There are benefits to certifications. I've seen companies that we've helped, especially small companies, that after they achieve certification, they feel a lot better about their growth potential and their ability to grow, where they didn't have any standardization within or very little standardization within the organization. Now they feel equipped that if they are able to grow, they have the knowledge, the standard processes and practices in place to help them with their growth. It's helped with determining, who they should work with and how to transition, whether it's a teaming partner, a vendor, or supplier. Now they have a practice in place that guides them through the decision-making process for that and how to successfully transition from one company to the next if they need to. It's increased their opportunity to be able to bid on additional work. A lot of the certifications out there that we kind of mentioned will allow you, if you're able to achieve it, allow you to bid on work that you weren't able to before, because now you can compete with your competitors. And there's usually less impact for having to be the lowest price technically acceptable provider or supplier out there, or that you can only bid on those type of contracts, which has an impact on your business revenue and growth, because you're not able to bid on larger opportunities where that requirement is not there. So there are a lot of benefits for certification. A lot of the ones I just mentioned are external. Internally, we've seen where staff members have grown. They've understood that these best practices are in place for good reasons and not negative reasons, and it helps them to better manage their areas and have all areas within the back office or functional support groups be able to manage and complete their day-to-day tasks efficiently and effectively, and have key measurements or quality control checks in place to measure their performance and stay on task. In general, best practices, I believe, are a good thing. I don't believe there's much negative into implementing and certifying to best practices, unless maybe you were not coached correctly or may not have applied the best practices that fits the organization's needs. That in those cases, it could feel that it's a negative impact on the organization. But if done correctly, if done right, these best practices are good for helping organizations to stay relevant if they're large and they're always looking at ways to improving, to growing and maturing in a positive manner instead of kind of winging it. You actually have standard practices in place to help guide you through that. And I think that a lot of federal agencies already see the benefits of looking and seeing and knowing that organizations that they are awarding work to have these best practices in place. And it is picking up in the commercial sector as well. It helps you to better identify risk or have a risk-based thinking approach within your organization, because then you can hopefully prevent any issues prior to them actually occurring, but you had a beat on it. You had actions in place prior to because you had this methodology in place ahead of time. And also, smaller budgets do not always block you from achieving your goal. We have worked with many of our small and medium-sized clients who do have smaller budgets, but still have been able to help them with achieving their certifications by helping them to develop a strategic plan and phase in certifications and when is the right time to do so based upon their needs, constraints, and resources. So having best practices in place, I think, is always a positive, and it does help organizations that do implement them correctly and always ensure that they have the resources available to maintain their best practice goals and metrics and measures within their organization. Finally, the last slide of our presentation focuses on some of these lessons learned. These are lessons learned, again, that the consultants have provided internally to me, and even in discussion with some of our clients. A lot of the organizations we support, the first thing we tell them is, let's talk about scope. If you don't correctly kind of have an approach or define the scope of where you want to apply these best practices, you may apply them incorrectly. You may create more work for yourself. And again, that would negatively impact, your schedule and timeline, and also your ability to maintain the certification because you didn't scope it and you didn't think about where you really need to apply these best practices. Also, doing an assessment prior to implementing, knowing where your strengths and weaknesses are to these best practice requirements helps you guide the implementation plan for how you're going to implement the best practices, and also have a realistic timeline of how long it would take for these best practices to be implemented and for your organization to be ready to be certified. Definitely understanding the impact of your business needs, strengths and weaknesses or limitations for technology resources, and understanding what your compliance requirements are will help you with guiding the path to certification and knowing which best practices, or I should say which certifications, you should strategically look at obtaining first. I've already touched on risk-based thinking. I think this is huge within any organization, whether federal, contract, or commercial. If you are performing good risk-based thinking practices within your organization, you are already on the right track of being successful, whether you're getting certified or not. Effective planning also helps mitigate risk for certification. It increases your chances of achieving certification within your timeline and within the goals that the business needs for the business to grow, whether it's growth in size or growth in revenue and profit. And the biggest mistake that I see with companies who are contacting us for potential support is that they're waiting too long. These organization certifications do take some time. They don't take forever, but they do take some time to implement within your organization if you want them to really not only obtain certification, but also want to see return on value and investment in the long term. So if you plan ahead of time, you have a strategic plan, which can change and can be adaptable. It's not written in stone. But if you just took the effort to plan and not wait till last minute for certification, chances are from a certification perspective, you will be successful in achieving. You will be able to achieve, you will be able to support the business strategy and goals that you have within your organization. And there's more positive than negative. And it's also a more positive experience for those within your organization who need to support this best practice being implemented within your organization, throughout the life cycle of your certification or just as part of your work culture and environment. I want to thank you again for taking time to participate and listen to our webinar. I look forward to any questions you may have. And again, I apologize if I might not have covered any specific topic that you wanted to hear about, but please let me know your questions. I'll be more than happy to give you the answers that hopefully that you're looking for. And again, thank you again. And this concludes our webinar for Integration Technologies Group, Why Waiting for Certification Can Be Bad for Business. And I will turn it over to our support team who will help guide with answering some of your questions. Again, my name is Brent Green, Business Development Manager with the Consulting Practice Group here at ITG, and I thank you again